Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is the 118th episode of Making Sense of the Chaos. As our custom is, on Mondays and Thursdays, we go over the basic principles that set the framework for understanding God's world, His creation, and what His purposes are through His eyes. The first principle is that God created the cosmos for His glory, not for the glory of mankind. This is really, really important and generally missed. But if you miss this point, all of your theology is going to be astray. Now remember, in the beginning of anybody's faith walk, after you've been converted, getting the theology wrong doesn't make much difference. It's kind of like hitting a golf ball. If your golf ball is hit just 1 degree off target at 10 yards, that's not going to be even a noticeable difference. It's going to appear to be right on target. At 20 yards, it probably still won't. At 100 yards, it will be noticeable. At 200 yards, it'll be very noticeable. And if you're able to hit the ball 300 yards, a 1 degree error is probably going to put you off the golf course. So, in the same way, when we misunderstand anything about God or us, and we get our theology wrong or our anthropology wrong, essentially, if we lower God, if we destroy the distinction between the Creator and the creatures, ourselves as creatures and God as Creator, if somehow, instead of seeing it as God above and we're infinitely below Him, we lower Him somewhat and draw those two phenomena closer to one another, then we've got something wrong, and it's going to create problems later on in what you're doing. My father was a carpenter, and when he built a house, the first thing he had to do was to lay the foundation correctly. If he did not lay the foundation correctly, a small error there was going to result in large errors somewhere else in the building of the house. If when he laid his plates and he erected his studs and put the upper plate, if that was off, if it wasn't plumb, then ultimately the whole house would fall down, because a small degree of error could be a 2-inch degree in the plumbness of the house, which puts great stress on the structure. Now, it may take 50 years, it may take 100 years for the house to fall, but it will fall, because gravity is not just going straight down anymore, it's going at an angle. If the house is canted over just slightly, then gravity is pulling it this way, not this way. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that when gravity is pulling it at this way and its strength is this way, you're going to have a problem somewhere down the line. Well, listen, what a builder has to do in building a house, a Christian has to do in building his theology. If you don't build your theology correctly, it will not be in line with what God has to say. It will be leaned over somewhat, and the stresses of life are like the stresses of gravity, and they will be pushing down against you, and you won't be resting securely on the rock of your salvation, Jesus Christ. You will be resting somewhat on man, because there are only 2 stanchions upon which you can build. One is God and one is man. One leads to perfect order, and the other leads to chaos. Those are the only 2 choices. And if you haven't built perfectly upon God, then you've built partly upon man. And inasmuch as you've done that, you have set yourself up for failure, not only for you, but for the people you love, the people who depend on you. Now, it may not show up in your life. It may take 500 years for the error to show up, but it will show up. It will. Now, why would you want to do that? Not only to yourself, but to your children and your children's children. Don't you love all these people? Of course you do. Well, then get it right. Well, it's painful and it's difficult, and how can I be sure? Well, I'm trying to tell you that. I'm trying to tell you that. but you start with a foundation that's properly laid. And the first part of that foundation is that God created everything for his glory. In Isaiah 43:7 we find that. But also in Ephesians chapter 1, when Paul talks about we have been elected by God for his glory. The reason for God saving anybody is not to save that person first, it's for his glory. He's God, you're not. If you're the focus of what God's doing, then God can't be God, because you are not sufficient to be his chief focus. How could you be? If God's chief contemplation is not himself and his glory, then it has to be something less than him, because there's nothing else as great as him but himself. So if it's not himself, it has to be something less than him. Then God, the highest value, the highest glory, is devoted to something less than his glory. That does not compute. That is not a possibility. And if you start trying to judge God by human categories, you have now flipped the creator-creature distinction. You have put yourself in the position of judging God, and you have decided that you merit that position. That is exactly the same sin that Adam committed in the Garden of Eden. So you must start with God's glory. Everything must be directed toward God's glory. That's what his purpose in his creation was. Second, now I'm not trying to diminish the value of man, because my second point deals with anthropology. The jewel of creation is mankind. Not man as male, but mankind is male and female. That is, men are made in the image of God. Okay? Now, men generically means male and female. A man all by himself is not the fullness of humanity in the image of God. A man and a woman are the fullness of humanity in the image of God. So, look, I am not trying to diminish the value of women. They are exactly of the same value as men. They serve a different function, but they don't have a different value. Okay? So when I say men, I mean man and woman, unless I'm specifically talking about males. But if I'm not specifically talking about males, I'm talking about humanity. And I use the traditional word for that, man. Now, you want to slap me for that? Well, come on over. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, of sin, God ordained Adam's fall. Now, this is necessarily so, because otherwise God could not be omniscient, omnipotent, he could not be immutable, that is never changing, because if Adam had fallen and it wasn't part of God's plan, then God did not know about it. If God knew about it, then it had to be part of his plan. Period. Period. People say, well, yeah, God knew about it, but it wasn't part of his plan. Well, how is that possible? How is that possible? If God knows a thing is going to happen, it has to happen. His knowing a thing is going to happen is exactly the same thing as his decreeing that it happen. It cannot do anything but happen. Otherwise, he doesn't know it. If it does not happen, then he did not know it. And he's not omniscient. If he's omniscient, then everything that he knows will happen, will happen. It is exactly the same thing as saying he has decreed that it should happen. Well, I don't like that. Okay, then you don't like that. You know, take your pacifier and go suck it in the corner over there. Oh, that's pretty rough. Yeah, well, it is. It is. It was not always be a picnic being my child, by the way. I had a tendency to be blunt. In Adam, fourth, the entire creation fell. The entire creation. Not only Adam and Eve, but all of their progeny, all of their offspring to come, all of them, every single one, fell in Adam. not only did they all fall, also the creation fell. Now we know that's true because we're told that henceforth man would work by the sweat of his brow, that there would be thorns and thistles that he would have to struggle with. And we're also told in Romans 8 that the creation groans awaiting its redemption. That's by Paul. Well, if it's awaiting its redemption, then obviously it must have fallen. Man needed to be redeemed because he had fallen. If the creation needs to be redeemed, it fell. Fifth, as a result of the fall, in Genesis 3:15, God pronounced a curse of enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. The seed of the woman is Jesus Christ, and at that point, it was just in seed form. It was what's called the evangelium, proto-evangelion, the promise of the coming Messiah. Now, we know in retrospect that all of humanity that God had called would be in Jesus Christ and saved in him and would be the seed of the woman as well. Now, the seed of the serpent is all of unredeemed mankind, which means all of the seed of Adam and Eve, until they are removed from the seed of the serpent into the seed of the woman, they remain the seed of the serpent. If they die outside of Jesus, then they die as the seed of the serpent. And there's this conflict, this division between these two great parts of humanity, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and that defines history from the fall until the judgment day. This is known as the great antithesis, by the way. And our sixth point, of course, is what I just said, that all subsequent human experience, all of history, is an outworking of this great antithesis. Seventh, for those who think it's unfair, the unregenerate, the seed of the serpent, they know who God is, and they suppress that truth in unrighteousness. They do not go to hell because they lacked sufficient knowledge of God. They go to hell because they deny and suppress the truth about God in open rebellion, in willful self-deceit. Well, how does self-deceit work? Hey, don't you deceive yourself about all kinds of things? You know, after you have a rude awakening, you've been chasing a butterfly of one kind or another that's an illusion, and you have that boom moment where you hit reality and you realize that you've been following a lie. And in that moment, don't you realize that you always knew it was a lie, but you were deceiving yourself? Well, in the same way, unbelievers deceive themselves about the truth of God, and they do it on purpose, and they do it with guilt. The last point is that the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. And that word is also the root word for moronic. So, those who are perishing, the seed of the serpent, regard the gospel as moronic. And they regard those who present the gospel to them as morons. So, if you are presenting the gospel to an unbeliever, you must understand that he does not welcome you with grateful, open arms. And don't be surprised that he's going to resist what you have to say. He may be polite, but I assure you, he's going to think you're a moron. And he's going to think your message is moronic. That's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. And that's the way it is. Okay, now we're talking about Arminianism. Now, that's the majority position in America regarding soteriology. What does that mean? Well, soteriology is the study of how God saves people. And essentially, there really are only two options. Either God saves people sovereignly, all by himself, or Jesus, by his death on the cross, and God, through his plan and the Holy Spirit, make men savable, but it's up to the men themselves to cooperate as fallen creatures with the grace of God in saving themselves. It's one or the other. Okay? Now, how much cooperation is required may differ. For instance, Roman Catholics believe that man's salvation requires him to continue to work toward his salvation. Not only does he have to ask for faith, but the truth is that in Roman Catholicism, that gift of faith is given at baptism. And after that, a man must work toward his salvation. He must constantly seek to be righteous and to avoid sin. And when he falls into sin, he loses his sanctification, and he has to go to confession and be forgiven, and then he goes back to work on his salvation. Now, most Arminians simply believe that man has to do a work of coming to faith in God or asking Jesus to save them, which is the same thing. I mean, to ask, for a rebel to ask that his heart be turned away from his rebellion is an impossibility unless his heart has already been turned away from his rebellion. How does a rebellious heart sovereignly choose to give up its rebellion? The nature of that heart, its very nature, is rebellion. Okay, in Romans 8:7, Paul tells us that the carnal man, the fleshly man, the unregenerate, is enmity against God. That is what he is. It's not merely what he does. He does that. He acts out of enmity to God because that's what he is. All right? A vulture acts like a vulture because he is a vulture. It's his nature. Okay? He doesn't sing like a songbird. He doesn't, he doesn't eat seeds and grain. He eats dead meat because that's his nature. It's the way it is. Okay. Now, my view of the drama that's being played out on earth, that God's cosmic drama of good versus evil, is that it's sort of a play, a Shakespearean play, but played on the entire world. You know, Shakespeare said the entire world is a play, and the world is the stage, okay, and we are but the players on the stage, and that's true. That's how I see this whole thing. And so, the way I present this is as a romance, an adventure story, and a romance where we have the hero, we have the villain, and we have the damsel in distress. We have good and we have evil, and they're at war with one another, and that's the outworking of that war is the story of life. It's the story of the cosmos. It's the story of God's creation. So, anyway, one of the dangers in any romance, and this is a romance, remember, is this threat posed by rivals. The real greatest story ever told is no exception. While the fidelity of the hero bridegroom is beyond question, the fair damsel, the seed of the woman, the church, comes from the wrong side of the tracks. Isn't that true? Don't we come from the seed of the serpent? Yes. She is far more unstable than he is, and she is in continual danger of having her head turned. Yeah. Doubting the value of her undeserved favored status, because remember now, she knows where she came from, and she's always a little insecure about that. And deeply impressed with the villain's wealth, power, and cachet, she is forever chasing after his acceptance. Don't you see that in the world? Don't you see the church always, what? Begging the world to accept them. I mean, academically, think about this. How many Christian colleges seek accreditation from secular institutions? I mean, we want the secular world to tell us that we're doing well. That's nonsense. They won't. Perversely, she often compromises her integrity to gain his approval in ungrateful disloyalty to her betrothed, Jesus. Complicating the situation from the bride's perspective, ours, in the true greatest story is her ambivalence toward the villain. That is, we have mixed feelings. The seed of the serpent, out of whom she came. Even when she identifies openly with the bridegroom, Jesus, in feigned innocence, she seeks to justify to herself her attraction to her nemesis, the seed of the serpent. She dismisses her betrothed's warning of the villain's enmity toward her. Is he really our enemy? Oh, come on now. They just don't know enough. But, you know, we're all children of God, aren't we? That's what they tell themselves. Although that's not what the Bible says. It's not what Jesus himself says. I mean, he tells a bunch of Jews, Pharisees, in John chapter 8, that they are children of their father, Satan. So much for the universal fatherhood of God and the universal brotherhood of man, right? Oh, well, you don't like that. Sorry, take that up with Jesus. Instead of being wary of him, she tries to avoid alienating him in any way, preferring to flatter him in his delusion of magisterial sovereignty to gain his acceptance or perhaps even his approval. Isn't that good? The world approves of us. Wow. Oh, you're so smart, you Christians. Look, if they're kissing your behind, you may be sure there's a knife in their hand somewhere. And they're just looking to get behind you to use that knife. All right? So don't turn your back on them. In her pursuit of the villain's love and acceptance, she first offers her most prized possession, truth, which he rejects. Who is truth? Jesus, right? So she offers him truth. Anxiously seeking his approval at any cost, she adds untrue elements to truth, the gospel, in hopes he will drink her summer wine with her. Of course, he is never fooled. His taste buds are exquisitely honed to detect and eliminate truth, the gospel, which he senses always comes at the price of his libertinism. That is, his freedom to pursue his own evil desires, preferring instead the heady elixir of the delusion of sovereign grandeur, as de Gaulle would have said, grandeur. Inadvertently also poisoned by the lies she has added to the cup of truth, the gospel, prepared to please the villain's palate, and from which she too has sipped. She is slowly succumbing to the temptation to turn her back on truth, lest she offend the seed of the serpent, the villain, her declared enemy, and is contemplating further concessions of truth, lest she offend his intimations of grandeur. Well, you know, he's God, isn't he? I mean, his mind is the ultimate source of all truth. He's the definer of what's true and what's not true, isn't he? That's what he says. And you don't want to tell him he's not, because he might not like you. With Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden, all of humanity fell, and therefore all of Adam's seed, which was incipiently in him, belonged from that time forward to the class God identified in Genesis 3:15 as the seed of the serpent, in a reprise of the original creation where Eve was formed out of the side of Adam. God formed the new Eve out of Adam again. For out of fallen man would come a redeemed race, the seed of the woman, chosen by the Father Creator for the Son bridegroom as his bride. Isn't that what happened? I mean, Where did you come from if you're a Christian? Didn't you come from the world? Weren't you in the world and then God redeemed you out of the world? And the world is the seed of the serpent. So you were redeemed out of the seed of the serpent. And the seed of the serpent is fallen Adam. Who is the head of the seed of the serpent? In human terms, it's Adam. Adam is the federal head of all fallen creatures. Adam is. So you come out of Adam into the new Adam, the seed of the woman, Jesus. Does that make sense? The fickle bride often takes the hero's self-sacrifice for granted, attracted as she is by the rough, macho worldliness of the villain. She succumbs to the temptation to judge the demands and fidelity of the hero against the promises of the villain by the standard of her own autonomy, a reprise of Adam's original sin. We will see how she was rescued by the hero from the snare of self-will, incorporated in every form of works righteousness by which man seeks to earn his salvation before God. That was the Reformation. The Reformation rescued the bride, okay, from the snares of self-righteousness into relying entirely upon the righteousness of God alone. And now we're drifting right back into that very same thing. Jesus speaking the word of truth through his soldiers, Luther, Calvin, and the other great reformers, in response to the lilt of the siren song of human ability to initiate reconciliation with God, preached and taught salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in the sacrificial death and resurrection of Jesus alone, by the work of his Holy Spirit alone, to the glory of God alone. But Satan, working through his seed of the serpent, has remained committed to his enmity toward Jesus and his seed, although acting subtly through artifice and deception, but never abandoning his mission of opposition. Satan is always pushing against God and God's people. If he isn't getting success in one area, he shifts over to another. But he's always probing, looking for weaknesses, and he pushes against the weaknesses. But if you resist the devil, he will flee. If you don't resist the devil, he will find your weak spots and exploit them. That's what he does. In this section, we will outline the struggles of the bride with the remaining traces of her original nature, her dark past. That's us. What's our dark past? When we were in the world. Having once been included within the seed of the serpent, the villain, she has been miraculously given new life as a wholly new creature by the Father through his Spirit. Yet she continually overlooks the villain's enmity directed toward her, insisting on fawning over him as a slightly naughty fellow, then alternating between puzzlement at his occasional burst of open hostility toward her and admiration for his self-assurance, as she seeks to sit at his table in the public square. She forgets his table is in God's square. He doesn't own the public square. God does. Presently, we will trace the descent from the lofty eyrie, and that's an eagle's nest, but I love using pretty words, of truth reached by the reformers back into the morass of human will worship, as the bride listened to the seductive whispers of humanists urging that an aspect of grace is its even-handedness, that it is only just and fair that each person should be given an equal shot at the brass ring of salvation. Thereby foolishly and futilely they attempt to rob the hero and his Father of the glory of redeeming their creation and its crowning jewel, the bride, from the slave market of sin through his sovereign grace and mercy alone. All right. We've just about reached the end of our time, and I have a whole new section I need to talk about, so I don't want to get started on that, and we'll close at that point. I want you to think about the things that we've discussed today. These are very, very important. And I am absolutely convinced that this is where the truth lies. And if you fail to accept this, then you're going to accept error. And in following error, once again, you will veer off the path that you should be on, and ultimately you will end up lost in the woods, in the swamp, in the quicksand, in chaos. Because there are only two poles. There's God and order, and there's man and chaos. That's it. There's no third choice. And you're either moving toward one or the other. You cannot go down the middle. You cannot go down the middle. There is no middle. There's one pole or the other. You got to choose. You can't compromise between the two. When you compromise truth with error, you don't get truth. You get error. When you compromise truth with a lie, you don't have truth. You have a lie. It's the only possibility. Now, if what I think is true is false, someone needs to show me that. Otherwise, I'm going to teach it as the truth, and I'm going to teach it to you. And you need to examine Scripture in your heart to see if that is in fact true. Pray over it. Bill, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just want to say hello to the people watching on the watch party. It's Tim Marks, Jerry Landry, Clayton Benning, Cody Corville, that's Isaac's wife, Josh Duncan, and Mr. Jimmy Genovese, and Carla Joe. Thanks, y'all.
Thank y'all. Have a great day. And remember, there are worse things than dying, and the very worst of all is being unfaithful to God. God bless you.